Progress.
Bonjour à tous.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos.
Bonjour.
Bienvenue. Bonjour. On va attendre quelques instants que l'ensemble des personnes qui le souhaitent nous rejoignent. Encore quelques personnes qui nous rejoignent. Bonjour à tous. Bonjour, Élise Viva, du pôle recherche de l'association. Je vais juste...
Good afternoon, everybody. Elise Viva from the Association Research Department. I'm going to provide some practical information. We will be using Zoom for the symposium. There will be simultaneous translation in 5 languages. So please choose the language. You go to the little globe icon, click on it and choose the language. The whole event will be translated so you can listen to whichever language you choose. You can also ask questions, but during the presentation, please ask your questions by posting them in the Q&A function. At the end of the meeting, depending on how much time we have, there will be a Q&A session. Following each presentation, there will also be a few minutes for a discussion with the speakers. And in that case, we encourage you to use this function, the raised hand. You can raise your virtual hand in the Zoom application. And depending on how much time we have, we will be listening to the questions and answering the questions. In that case, we will send you a notification to ask you to open your microphone and unmute your microphone so you can ask your question. So if you raise your hand because you have a question, depending on how much time we have available, you might be asked to unmute your microphone to ask your question and take the floor.
Je vais passer la parole à Guilba.
This is it, and I'm going to give the microphone to Guy Alba. Hello, Lise. Good afternoon, everybody. 138 people have registered for the symposium. That's quite a good number, especially on subjects that we are going to learn about. There are 17 different nationalities. It shows that although webinars on internet are at least smoothing out the borders, and we can organize meetings from many different countries. Whether you're a patient, family, doctor, an association member, you will be participating in this symposium that we organize every year. In the spring, we want to open ourselves to the international community of people suffering from leukodystrophies. And this symposium is supposed to bring together all the patients, regardless of where they live, across the borders. This is very important because it's going to give us the strength we need to ensure therapeutic progress. And, therapeutic progress is now urgent because research projects are increasing across the world, and we have to be cautious. And that's the reason why we are having this discussion. The objective of ELA International is clear. We need to define better rules to include in our partnerships with the research laboratories that will be carrying out research in the future. But it also means that we need to understand the patient's expectations and also the constraints that the researchers are facing. And we need to understand the willingness and the constraints for the laboratories and researchers. So 2 sessions we are going to listen to testimonies from parents and patients investigating physicians or researchers. And first subject, how to better involve the patients to a research program, especially during clinical trials. Because obviously during clinical trials, the collaboration from the patient is absolutely a prerequisite. And secondly, the partnerships and the fallout for the patient. So before I give the floor to Professor Grégoire Moutel, I'd like to thank the patients and their parents, especially those who have agreed to testify. And I would also like to thank Grégoire Moutel, who specializes in ethical issues for the teaching university, teaching hospital he works in Caen. And I would like to wish you all a very good symposium, and we will talk again later during the next session. Grégoire, please, you have the floor. Thank you, Guy. Well, normally we meet during meetings, but I am paying attention to the work conducted by ELA International for some years now. We initiated a project with Guy some years ago. It's actually a gateway towards research. We wanted to understand how to constitute biobanks into which we feed samples from the patients and what we could do with those on the economic, scientific level. And we meet again to talk about these research subjects. As Guy Elbaz said, I'm not going to read out my resume, but I would like to tell you about my background. I have the chance of being a member of the ethics committee in INSERM, and we have an increasing partnership with patients in these settings in order to determine the topic for research. The patients are now have a word and a say in regarding the subject for research, and also they can receive information, provide an informed consent, and finally information during the project, how the patients are being informed. And there will be a second panel discussion on these subjects. And it also crosses what I do in Normandy. I'm in charge of a regional ethics space, and we observe practices in the regions to bring them back to the National Ethics Committee. And we'll come back to that. But there are many, many questions, many complaints. There are patients who are not sufficiently informed regarding research subjects, and many patients are not directly involved. When we're dealing with children, for instance, the role played by their parents is not quite well defined. And so I'm very happy that this meeting is being organized today. Guy Elbaz said I am an expert. Well, I believe I have knowledge, but my knowledge was also acquired on the field from the patients, from the researchers, from the scientists. And we are going to exchange our information, and maybe I can contribute to these projects, but I would like you all to participate and ask questions. I don't want to be the only one speaking. So I'm going to introduce the first panel discussion, because I believe Valeria Calbi, who specializes in gene therapy trials regarding leukodystrophy. She is a very experienced practitioner, and we will understand what the researchers can do, and the role of researchers versus the patients. And I'm the timekeeper, so please, it's not easy for me. Please, keep to your allotted time so we have time for questions and discussions at the end of the presentation. Valeria, you have the floor from Italy. You can speak now.
I will try to share my screen. I hope you can see it. Okay, so good afternoon. I'm very delighted to be with you this afternoon. I'm sorry that I can't speak French, but I hope this will be clear for most of you. So as said, as investigator of MLD gene therapy trial, I will try to give you a brief overview on what was the story of our trial and what have been the challenges before and after the approval. So why do we wanted to start a clinical trial of MLD? So as scientists, as clinicians, of course, we have questions, scientific questions to answer, but from the patients and from family, of course, we have a need, a clinical need to cover. We have a rationale, maybe an idea that we want to put in practice. And of course, we need to have a dream or a big goal to achieve. So in our case, our question was on metachromatic leukodystrophy, that is a rare neurological disease. And our need from the patients and from the families, and also for us, for doctors, is the fact that this disease was without cure. So there was no any efficacious treatment. So only palliation and supportive care could be done. So the idea behind our trial was to try to translate into MLD the encouraging results that we were achieving with gene therapy in other genetic diseases, and especially in immunodeficiencies. So the idea was to correct bone marrow derived cells and make these cells to migrate into central nervous system where they can locally produce a functioning enzyme, a copy of the lacking enzyme, in order to correct the surrounding cells. Of course, all of these were yet to be demonstrated, and the story has been very long. So our dream that actually became a reality for most or at least many of our patients for many years now, for 8, 9, 10 years after the treatment, was to cure fully or at least partially a fatal disease with severely disabling symptoms like metachromatic leukodystrophy. And as I say, this story was very long. So it started 20 years ago. So it was early in 2000 when the preclinical studies started in the lab, and only in 2010 they were able to start the clinical trials on children, and eventually in 2020 we had the approval for gene therapy in metachromatic leukodystrophy. So the in vitro studies and the animal model studies, as we called, they are important to study the disease and to test a potential treatment in order to design a clinical study. Also in this phase, the patients and the family may play an important role, because as probably anticipated, also the biological samples from the patients that are affected can be very precious in order to find the reference range to design and create the in vitro studies. And at the same time, also the observation of the natural course, especially in rare disease like MLD, is in clinical trial like natural history trial are very important, because they can make us understand better and more in depth the disease in order to design better the clinical trial. And again, very early in the overall design of the trial, the engagement of the families and patients and families associations could be important, while we engage very early the regulators to get the scientific advice for the overall structure of the trial. So as said, it was 2006 when they were first published, the first studies with possible efficacy of the gene therapy in the mouse model. And while the scientists were working in the lab bench, we were starting the natural history trial, not only us, but different group also in Europe. And this were very important to try to understand better the disease, the classifications, the symptoms, the real burden, to try to understand the progression rate, to estimate the prognosis, and in order to really understand who we need to treat and when is the right time for treatment. Eventually, after many years, we arrived at the clinical trial with the proper enrollment criteria, endpoint objectives, but even in the story of the trial of 10 years of clinical trial, even the eligibility criteria changed over time, because we learned during the trial also really who were the patients that could benefit most from the treatment, understand that this treatment was mostly efficacious in the pre-symptomatic patients or in early symptomatic, and how to define the early symptomatic status. So during the clinical trial phase, the family and the patients have to be involved in a continuous process of communication. So of course, the informed consent, has formal steps with counseling, signatures, but overall is an ongoing and continuous communications that starts before the arrival of the family, during the pre-treatment phase, during the treatment, and also during the follow-up. We need to address and describe all the risks, the alternatives, what we know, and what is sometimes very difficult is also to try to explain what we don't know, because it's an experimental treatment, and why we don't know and why we don't have all the answer yet. And then, of course, we need to keep the patients and the family informed, also after the treatment, informed on what we are learning during the trial and from our experience. And then, of course, there is also a lot of bureaucracy, because as researchers, we are also required to keep the families involved and informed about bureaucratic things like change of the sponsor, information about the data transfer. All this documentation requires information, signatures, let's say bureaucracy, that sometimes is a burden also. I feel that is a burden also for the family, because the family already is under a lot of pressure, is isolated because of the diagnosis of the disease. It comes from a period of isolation because of the treatment, because it's a bone marrow transplant treatment, and is also isolated because, at least in our experience, we treated patients from 35 countries. So our patient comes really from all over the world, and they all have to, when they arrive, there is a lot of reorganization of their life before the arrival, even depending on the country, but even visa, permissions, passport. And at the arrival, there is a language barrier, there is another culture, there is the impact with the hospital and the hospitalization. And sometimes even coming back is difficult, because sometimes they may feel that nobody at home may understand what they have gone through. And all these really requires a personalized and holistic approach, and with many figures and with many expertise that I think they try to work around the family and the patients, that of course we ask clinicians and nurses, but also from the administrative point of view, also psychologists, cultural mediator, volunteers, and care coordinator and patient care that try to help the patient during this long journey that, at least for the gene therapy, sometimes is lasts very months. So after all this work, we arrived at the approval of the gene therapy, the EMA approval. So we have a drug. We have tried to identify a certain group of patients where this drug can be efficacious, but we have still a long line ahead. So we need to make this treatment in the real life available. And when we try to expand the treatment centers, there is still a lot of negotiation with the local health authorities. And even in this case, already the patients and family have done a lot to try to achieve and make these negotiations successful in order to have this treatment available and affordable. And there is also the need to engage the local physicians, because when we have outside the clinical trial, is also important to have engaged the local physician in order to have the follow-up done. So a big thanks to all of you. Just to say that we want to, from all of us, a big thanks to the family and to the patients. And this, I like these pictures because we have our first 2 patients that are now 10 years after the gene therapy. Thank you for attention. I'm sorry I couldn't see the clock if I've been too long.
Merci Valeria.
Well, thank you, Valeria. This was perfect. We are not going to continue right away with the group conversation, but I think that this shows how much progress research made. I think 20, 30 years ago, we would have never heard about cultural mediators, for example, the role of GPs, the role of families, the connections with families. We'll come back to this later, but obviously knowledge has evolved, but also practices have changed. And I'm saying this with a smile on my face. I know how difficult it is for researchers to make themselves available. They are obviously working on scientific questions first, but the fact they're also dedicated, they spend some of their time on administrative things. You described it very well. The administration part is a burden, but at the same time, it's important in terms of guarantees and insurance. Patients must be protected. In Europe, this is very important. Valeria, again, many thanks. We'll come back to you in a moment. We're going to move on to Florian. Florian, who's with us from Boston, who is working on adrenomyeloneuropathy, neuropathy, AMN. And I have to say, I really admire him and all the other experts around this table. So without further ado, over to you, Florian. So I hope I didn't make a mistake. I think we were expecting Florian or Florence. Okay, so sorry, Florence. I thought you were next. So, and then after this, we will have an opportunity to listen and to have our families on board as well. So Florence, not Florian, Florence, over to you. Thank you so much. And good day, everyone. I'm Florence Binet. I live in Angers, in France, with my husband and our 2 girls, Alice and Colleen, who both have metachromatic leukodystrophy. Alice started to show symptoms a little before age 2. She was struggling to walk, falling, struggling with her sleep, and she was increasingly finding it difficult to move herself. And at the end of February 2020, she had very strong fever, and after that, the disease really set in. Within 3 to 4 weeks, we saw Alice, who became unable to walk, speak, keep her head up, eat, and the leukodystrophy diagnosis came very quickly, early April 2020. Subsequently, we had to wait another 3 weeks to find out that it was metachromatic. She was diagnosed when she was 2 years and 9 months. Today she's 3 years. And so when we had we were diagnosed at the end of 2020. She's three years plus. Colleen, who was not even one, was in great shape. She had not been diagnosed yet. She had no symptoms, and nothing was predicting the pathology. I remember she was perfectly healthy. She was very different from Alice. She was much more awake. She was more flexible, more mature. But the disease was there. It was there, and when we did the tests in May 2020, Colleen was also diagnosed. So this was a second blow to the family, a tough one. The neuropediatrician told us that there was hope for Colleen, and the hope was to have access to gene therapy described earlier by Valeria. So gene therapy, which is available at the San Raffaele Hospital in Milan. So very quickly, we were put in contact with the team. When I say quickly, I mean literally a week after the diagnosis. So this was mid-May. So we had a video conference with the Milan team the following week. And we had a meeting June 1st in Milan to start the preliminary testing. We put everybody in the car and we went to Milan for 4 months, hoping we would have access to the trial. So all this went very quickly. The diagnostic of Alice, Colleen, managing Alice's overall degrading condition, the pain, the frustrations. We were in the middle of the lockdown in France, and so we were in the state of emergency, and obviously we were able to go to Italy very quickly. When this happens to you, you cannot really put things in perspective. It's just not possible. It was a tough situation, and obviously we sought help. The neuropediatrician and Dr. Bart in Angers told us to reach out to ELA. They said, don't Google leukodystrophy. Get in touch with the right people. And so that's what happened, and we were able to get a lot of helpful information from ELA on leukodystrophy, on trials, and we were put in touch with a number of families, including the Hogue family. They went through the same thing, I think a few years before we did. So we were able to have access to the first results of the Milan gene therapy trial. What we heard is that they had about 10 years of experience after the first patients treated. The first results were good and positive. So we got the feeling that something would be possible for Colleen, and that's the reason why we went to Milan. As a mother, I trusted physicians. Milan was the only potential chance for Colleen to live a better life, and so I just followed. My husband needed to better understand. He needed to understand exactly the ins and outs, understand the condition of the kids after the treatment. What he really wanted to know is it worth it? Does it really make life easier? So we got a lot of documents from ELA, a lot of material, videos, presenting results, and giving us a lot of insights. And once we were in Italy, physicians spent a lot of time describing the process, as Valeria described earlier. They really took the time to take us through things step by step. The preliminary checks, the enrollment criteria, test results, and so on and so on. A lot of this was presented to us orally in Italian. We were fortunate enough to have interpreters who were there to translate for us, but this is obviously a huge amount of information. And again, all this is done in a state of emergency where, your brain doesn't really work as it should. It's a lot of things you need to absorb. Your brain needs to absorb, and in addition to that, we have to sign a zillion documents. I can't even tell you what I signed. All kinds of consent documents, approval documents, and so on and so on. Anyway, back to the trial now, to the trial itself. In June 2020, the clinical trial had been finished, and we got a compassionate treatment, additional treatment from our trial, but there was experience with the therapy results. We're starting to become official when it comes to treatment efficacy. Once we arrived in Milan, Colleen was hospitalized several times and eventually became eligible for the therapy, and she was transfused July 17th, 2020, when she was a little over a year old. Everything went well. It was globally positive. We had an amazing team. They were listening very well. They were very attentive, and I'm glad they were, and I'm glad things were expedited, because we could not afford to wait much longer. Other families, unfortunately, were not as lucky. Some children arrived in Milan and did not have access to the disease, to the trial, to the therapy, because the disease had progressed too much. So I think there are three important things I would like to express and contribute to the debate. Access to information for families first, trial results, statistics, global statistics and detailed statistics. The pathology can greatly vary from one child to another. It can progress at very different speeds, and we would have liked to have more details on age, the age of treatment, what age children were treated, how they responded, and what condition they're in today. But as a parent, obviously, you need to know where you're headed. You need to know what the outcome is like, what to expect, what to possibly expect, and in what case. All these things, of course, you want to be hopeful, but at the same time, you have to be realistic, right? I think. I wish I could have heard what Valeria said a few minutes ago before. The second topic is the transparency regarding the enrollment criteria for a clinical trial. All the tests and exams you have to go through. You need to tick a lot of boxes. My child went through the test. Was it 100% good? Or is it only 80% good? That we don't know. Why do some children not tick all the boxes? I think it's important to be really, really transparent on this for us to fully understand as parents. Last but not least, the consent. As I said, we signed hundreds of consent forms, and you don't know what you're signing. You don't know if you agree with everything or not. You don't know if certain things are negotiable or not, simply because you don't have the time for it. So you can't put things in perspective. So, in conclusion, as a parent, what I would like to say, as a parent of a child who is in a trial, what we need is summarized yet detailed information on these treatments. These are difficult treatments. They're long treatments. They take a toll on everyone, the entire family. So you need to be as informed as possible of what is at stake, and always remain objective. Keep hope, but at the same time, be objective. And so that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Florence, for being so sincere, and thank you very much also for the points you made and for the questions you raise. Speaking in public as a parent is not easy. It's difficult to put the right words. I think you did it very well. You sounded very clear. You sounded very professional. We're going to move on to the following trial in a moment, but to put a bit of flesh around the subject, I think it's important to say that there's no criticism. This afternoon is only about improving things. As I said earlier, I think researchers and physicians, including myself, need this kind of feedback to improve the way we practice. We see many things, but we don't see everything. Physicians, scientists don't see everything because we are also working on very tight schedules. We're busy. We're happy. We believe in what we do, but putting things in perspective and putting things in line with the fundamental human needs of families is not always easy. So I think physicians need the same thing you need. You are very happy to hear what Valeria said, but I'm sure Valeria is very happy to hear what you said, Florence. Back in putting on my head as a my cap or hat as a scientist, when you build a trial, a clinical trial, you need to think about everything, including communication. How are you going to communicate and so on? Communication and all the other things cost money. It needs resources, internet and all kinds of other resources. So the funding part is obviously essential. This is something ELA is very active on. And some of the funding should cover, the communication with parents. So you mentioned the fact that you signed hundreds of documents, consent documents, and this is true. One of the things that defines the relationship is oftentimes trust. But in a sense, sometimes you simply don't know. And it is important to have institutions that guarantee the quality of things. And as I was telling Valeria earlier, what is a burden for her is not necessarily a burden for you because you sign documents. But in France, there are institutions with healthcare professionals who are here to ensure the highest quality of clinical trials. Just in case something are not done in the right way. We have top researchers here, but sometimes you could have more fragile researchers, scientifically speaking. So this is why all these documents have to be signed, because there are institutions behind that do the quality control, in a sense. So again, Florence, many thanks. Let's now this time we are going to reach out to Florian. I apologize again, Florian. I thought it was your turn earlier. So we're going to talk about the topic I announced earlier on AMN, and then we will move on with to Jean-François Plata-Rotti. So Florian, this time it really is your turn. Again, thank you so much for connecting from the US, faraway US.
I hope you can hear me okay. Yes. Yes, I'm delighted to be here, and also it was very appropriate for Florence to speak before me, because this was really the important patient voice that needed to be heard as we enter discussions around trials. In short, trials come about through collaborations, and they're collaborations not only between physician scientists such as myself and industry sponsors, but also collaborations with patients, patient advocates. And so it really needs all three stakeholders to drive trials forward. And in this process, I think we're increasingly seeing that the patient voice is important beyond being a participant alone, but being, as also Florence said, an informed contributor. And I would go further to even say an active contributor in defining what outcomes are important and meaningful in trials. So a slight correction, I'm not the main principal investigator of the Minorix trial, that is Wolfgang Köhler in Leipzig, but I am a site investigator in Boston, where we did enroll most of the US patients. And it was a wonderful experience to see many sites across the world come together for a first global trial in adrenomyeloneuropathy. As a site investigator, I witnessed how the patient voice was also brought into the trial, and how the sponsor interviewed many patients prior to setting up the trial. There were also patients who participated in scientific meetings on trial design. I think that was essential and something that has to occur moving forward. During the trial, we collected patient-reported outcomes that patients reported not only how they're functioning, but also how they're feeling in day-to-day activities. This encompassed everything from quality of life surveys, such as the European Dimension surveys, reporting on mobility and activities of daily living, anxiety, depression, but also quality of life surveys on urinary symptoms and erection problems, often things that are not well published in the medical literature. But moving forward, how can we do more? How can we bring in the patient voice more fully? And I think to do that, let me briefly outline the elements of trial design. As I see it, the elements of trial design encompass inclusion, exclusion criteria, the nature of the trial itself, whether this is a single treatment or continuous treatment, duration of trial, as well as clinical outcomes. And inclusion, exclusion, and clinical outcomes are closely linked. Often when we conduct first trials, the inclusion criteria, meaning who gets to actually participate in the trial, are very narrow. And this is done both for safety and efficacy reasons. And this is often upsetting to many families when they find out that they're not eligible for first treatments. The rationale is that if we establish safety in a community that tolerates this treatment, we can then subsequently broaden the inclusion to have more patients participate. I conduct and the PI of multiple gene therapy trials where we have staggered enrollment, whether that's gene therapy for Canavan disease or for Tay-Sachs and Sandhoff. And this is frustrating because patients and families have to wait until one patient has been safely enrolled after the next. And this means delays. And these are unfortunately situations that we have to go through in order to ensure safety of new experimental procedures. I think another thing to think about that often doesn't bring in enough of the patient perspective is what happens when a trial is discontinued. And we saw a brief clinical hold in the US on the Minarix trial. And this was difficult for many patients to understand that when there are some safety concerns or where the efficacy did not outweigh the safety, then this led to a clinical hold. So all in all, I think the discussion around trial design elements is shaped by risk-benefit ratio. And this risk-benefit ratio of the intervention needs to be undertaken in a discussion jointly with the patients early on, even as we're thinking and designing trials. First, of course, always come safety concerns. And we often hear in discussions with patients and families that they're often willing to take on more risks than physicians and sponsors are willing to take on. And that is understandable from their perspective, where they've been living with this disease and the burden and many aspects that we physicians do not experience day to day. But on the other hand, the patients, families may not be aware of the kinds of adverse events, the kinds of risks that they will experience because this has never been experienced before. So it's a very difficult situation for new experimental trials, particularly gene therapy trials. What does the future hold? I think in the future, we will see more patient active participation. I hope as we will deliver on what Florence asked for, which is more information and access to information. And let me speak to that briefly. In an upcoming trial for women with ALD, we will have exit interviews of patients where we will not only perform quality of life surveys, but have actual open-ended questions and interviews where women can give feedback on their trial experience. This is becoming an increasing practice across many clinical trials, not only in neurology. I will but briefly mention that there are also organizations like Patients Like Me, that some of you might have heard of, that are organizations that also try to assemble patient-reported outcome and advance sharing of data so that there can be something that patients can access on real world health experience. And this is helping some trials accelerate, helping the process of bringing new outcomes forward in ways that we didn't see before. Overall, an important question in the future will be data sharing, not only among sponsors and investigators, but according to the way that Patients Like Me have shown, is there a way that patients themselves can receive data, and how can they share their experience, not only of the disease, but also potential treatments they're undergoing. I think in the future, we also have to think about treatments that could go beyond the often narrow inclusion window of intervention that we are currently targeting. Often we're looking for early stage disease, unable to address the more advanced stage disease that plagues and is a burden to many families. Are there ways we can advance trials for symptomatic patients using known symptomatic treatments? Are there FDA-approved compounds where the risk-benefit ratio might allow us to move faster? So I think these are all things that we need to consider in the future as we bring the patient voice into trial design. Thank you. I hope I kept on time, Grégoire.
Un grand merci, Florian.
Thank you, Florian, for this contribution. We don't want to spoil the discussion with the rest of the audience and anticipate too much, but just a few items to anticipate on the future discussion. Valeria talked about the problem of non-inclusion and the fact that scientific experts have to make this understandable for patients. You know, it's when you are dealing with care and therapies, where there are criteria that have been validated and are applied to the patients, but it's already difficult to get the patients to understand why some patients get the treatment and why some don't. But in the field of research, we really need to make an effort so that people understand. I'm sorry if I'm a bit blunt, but research is not about showing empathy. Research is about applying very drastic conditions so that we make sure that the medication gets to be manufactured and accessible to more people. When you're a researcher, you would like, obviously, to include more patients, but one, you can't do it because you won't be efficient, and two, and that's what really matters, it's the risk-taking idea that we need to understand. You have to be brave enough to say that when you do research, you take risks, and that includes the patient. So we need to get people to understand that researchers, although they have their own scientific beliefs, have to understand that sometimes research will also be detrimental to some patients. So we are very, very stringent on the inclusions, and unfortunately, people in the general opinion do not understand that, and they think, oh, research is great, research is for people who are sick, and when you're sick yourself, obviously you're a bit blinded and you want access to the treatment. So that's a discussion that we're having between us. You also talked about sharing data, and this is something we will discuss during the second roundtable, but we need people to understand that the commercial value of patients is such that, well, you know, usually we don't tell them exactly what it means and what the value can be for research, but people are increasingly aware of that. There are discussions now, as I said, we will discuss it during the second panel discussion. It means that the patients now are informed about the value of research and the value of their participation in research. So it makes sense that they are involved in the discussion. And you also talked about patients groups, and I like that, patients organizations, because in France we we ask ourselves lots of questions about that. We talk about expert patients. We see whether we can discuss the concept of expert patient. But roughly speaking, for many diseases, the patient has a huge responsibility when he or she is asked to collect data on his real life, everyday life. Because sometimes when the data is not good quality data, then the research will not be good quality research. So it's very important that patients become experts themselves. They have to be trained so that they collect useful data. And also in France, we're talking about patients who become actually assessors, auditors themselves. They will not be pseudo researchers, but as patients, they will be able to say, look, this data analysis process is interesting, especially for quality of life issues, for instance. So thank you very much for all these contributions. And we understand that in the near future, patients will play a role which is very different from what they used to do in the past. And François is probably going to say more things or more accurately than I can, because involved patients have their own way of seeing those things. So please, Jean-François, you have the floor. Can you hear me? Yes, very well. Great. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much to Guy for having given me a chance to testify as an adult patient suffering from an adrenomyeloneuropathy. Jean-François Platarotti, I'm 50 years old. I'm married. I have a 20-year-old daughter with an AMN which appeared in 2004. The disease progressed very slowly initially, and things picked up speed in 2012. Today, I have trouble walking because I need to use a crutch, especially when I go outside of my home. I can walk very short distances, less than 300 meters or yards. I'd like to tell you about the MINS 102 protocol, which is a program that I participated in, launched by the Minurix laboratory. This protocol, I was offered to participate in September of 2018 because I was eligible. I matched the inclusion criteria after a first examination at the hospital. They said I had to be able to walk unaided, with or without a crutch. I had to be a male patient. I had to have a form of the disease that was not cerebral, and I think that was it. Unfortunately, they did not include women, but there must be a reason. Possibly they have different symptoms versus men. Well, women do not suffer from any cerebral forms of the disease anyway. During the first 2 years of the protocol, it was a double-blind trial. Approximately 2/3, 1/3. 2/3 placebo, 1/3 received the medication, the therapy. So for the first 2 years, I wondered whether I was being given the medication or not, because I did not see any changes in my capacity to walk and also my bladder issues. 2 years are a very long time if you ask yourself questions, especially when you don't know whether you're getting the placebo or whether you're getting the actual therapy. And I could not wait to get the results of the effects of MIN 102. And I wanted to find out whether other patients who received the same therapy, whether they had improved or not. I received information when I asked, especially when I asked the project manager. She was very, she was willing to give me information regarding the progress, but my main issue was walking and traveling. I had to go to Paris to La Salpêtrière Hospital, and traveling was made easier because I was given a chance to be helped by somebody, in this case my wife. And so the traveling became easier. Staying in Paris also was easier, being there for every examination. although I was obviously helped by the hospital healthcare personnel as well, especially the project manager, who was very, very nice, very competent, and always eager to listen to everything I had to say or ask for right from the beginning of the protocol. I got all the information and explanations I asked for on, for instance, on the appointments, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, etc. And also all of the examinations that and tests I was to submit myself to. That was explained right from the beginning. Moreover, the doctor who's following me at the hospital, funnily enough, she's a pediatrician, actually, but she's in charge of children suffering from adrenoleukodystrophy. She's also a very nice person, always eager to listen to anything I ask for, answering my questions regarding my health status, the possible adverse events following the therapy. Fortunately, I did not actually get adverse events taking the drug, the medication. Although in my last blood workup, there was something that was a little off, but nothing really serious. So the protocol altogether lasted for 2 years. And after 2 years, I was told that I was actually given the therapy. And obviously, I was happy because it seems that it stopped me from developing the cerebral form of the disease. And that's probably the reason why women were not included in the trial, because they don't have the cerebral form. My MRIs were looked over by several specialists, and the outcome was satisfactory. They said that I had been stopped from developing the cerebral form, although they had some reservations to begin with. I don't think we need to inform the patients in complicated situations because, it's such a huge field of research. I mean, it's so complex. The scientific data is so complex. And I mean, you yourself know about that. So that's a summary. Sometimes it's necessary to be submitted to examinations and then receiving the results on the whole protocol, because we need to know whether any progress is being made. And finally, it's also important that we are given a summary of all the tests and examinations so that we know exactly in what state we are, in what our health status is. As a patient, you know how you feel, you know what issues you are facing. But anything biological like blood tests and urine tests, you don't really understand that. You don't know whether it's right or wrong or normal or abnormal. I was given information, but for Min 102, I was not having access to much information. I felt like the researchers were being very cautious. Maybe they wanted to keep the information confidential. But all in all, I must say that the protocol was rather well organized. I'm very happy that I was given a chance to participate, and in a way, I myself made a contribution to the research, although it did not improve my walking capacity. Unfortunately, and on the other, it's rather the contrary. My capacity to walk is not improving, it's deteriorating. But it seems that at least I was protected from developing the cerebral form of the disease. Now, question now, can the means 102 stop from developing the cerebral form of the disease? The request has been made. On the Minorix website, you can find more information. And you will find information regarding the whole protocol, although for now the data is still relatively reserved and confidential. Now, the good thing is that they told me I could stop anytime. I could stop after 2 years, because 2 years anyway was the end of the protocol as such. But I was allowed to either continue my participation or not, and I decided to stay in. Now, the drawback is that I never really met the lady who was really at the origin of the project, Dr. Michel. I never met her. And what the lady, Mrs. Binet, said before, and also I myself found was a challenge, was signing all the paper. All the paperwork was very, very tedious. All these documents I had to sign, I mean, they were read to me, I listened, but it was so much information to digest, and sometimes I did not really understand. And another drawback were the trips to Paris. When you live outside of Paris, in the provinces, I live something like 350 miles away from Paris, so it's not easy to travel to Paris, although we have now the fast train, the bullet train, still. Every time I had to take a couple of days off work to go to Paris. And I had to do MRIs, blood tests. I had to do a walking test. The drug had to be taken every day at the same time. And I had to write down the time at which I took the drug plus the dose. Everything had to be written in the book. And this I have been doing ever since 2018. So also not very easy, especially when you work. I mean, I work 100%. I work full time. What else can I say? Again, I work full time. It's becoming difficult though, for me. But I wanted to participate in the protocol. I simply leaned back and allowed the others to guide me. I trusted the doctors, the researchers. I thought, okay, let's go. Let's do it. If it's going to help research, then be it. So thank you very much to ELA, because ELA has been supporting me and supporting all the patients who are suffering from these diseases. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm obviously available. And I hope you have a very good symposium. Thank you, Jean-François. Because like Florence earlier, I really believe that this is important, that we hear the feedback from the patients. It's going to improve the practices. I'm not saying that the way we do this is not right, but there's always room for improvement. Even when things are being done well, they can always be done in a better way. So I'm not criticizing the way this is organized, but I hear what you say. For instance, when you say that there are constraints, well, when we do research, we have to always weigh the risk and versus the benefits. We inform the patients on the risk-benefit ratio. We tell patients, okay, every research is accompanied by a number of risks. And you also have to inform the patients not only on the risks, but also on the constraints, not because we want to turn them away, but simply because we want them to be ready. You remember earlier I said that it was important for patients to write down information and report information. Well, I used to be a diabetologist, so I know exactly what it means for a patient to write down, blood sugar levels every day. And for us researchers, it's always easy to communicate data, but we should maybe think about the way we support our patients, and that also has to do with the way we collect data. I don't want this to be a French discussion, but there is also the issue of traveling to the hospital and taking days off work. That needs to be taken in consideration. I know that patients do not participate in research to make money, but I think that they should be financially supported to make their life easier. I don't know how it went for you, but I have seen very many projects where that was overlooked. The patients were not supported so that they would travel in good conditions or did not have to sacrifice a day's work. and a day's pay. So I think that is something that we can improve. And finally, on the scientific level, you said, I don't know why women were not included in the trial. But again, that is something that we as researchers should have told you regarding the inclusion or exclusion criteria. Maybe in some cases we do not explain clearly enough to the patients why some people are included and some aren't. There definitely must be a reason why women are not included in this trial. Maybe Florian can explain that to us. But again, that needs to be explained. Some people will say it's discrimination. No, it's not discrimination. There is a scientific rationale here. But again, there is room for improvement. Oh, one last thing that you said that really actually struck me, and maybe we can raise the issue during the last panel discussion. How do we inform the patient regarding the protocol during the protocol? And you said maybe the information is confidential or privileged. Absolutely. In scientific research, there is competition between pharma companies. So yes, sometimes there is information that we cannot disclose because there are sponsors, because there will be papers being written and published, and therefore some information needs to be privileged because it is backed by financial interests. So we need to say that. We need to say to the patient, we're very sorry, but some information cannot be disclosed during the trial, except that we need to explain why. Yes, you're right. During the MIN 102 trial, I really felt like some information regarding the molecule was not being disclosed. I could feel quite clearly that I was not being told everything. Because I can understand that. I mean, the pharma company is footing the bills and also my traveling expenses. Well, I took my days off work for myself because I took like 15 times a couple of days off work. And I lost pay for those days. And over 3 years is not all that much, but they didn't pay for that. But at least they paid for the travel expenses. We patients and also the pharma companies and the doctors, well, we have to make sure that we share the constraints. Thank you very much, Jean-François, because this is going to fuel the discussion with the audience. But the one thing I wanted to point out here is that we need to improve the way we communicate to improve things in the future. And again, regarding privileged information, it's one thing to make the patient feel they're hiding things from me, or to tell the patient, sorry, there are some things we can't tell you because some information cannot be disclosed until the research is finished. Once it's finished, then we can tell you everything. That's the kind of dialogue we need to improve so that we have a better communication with the patients. And I am now going to give the floor to the audience, bearing in mind that we had more people who were supposed to talk about the first trial, Céline and Jean, and also Sébastien Mariotti. Maybe they could kick off the questions, or else we can move on to the question asked by all the participants. Okay, so maybe we can start. We have somebody assisting us and telling us who's going to be taking the floor first.
Personne que j'ai mentionné, Céline, Jean ou Sébastien.
Céline, Jean, or Sebastian? Yes, my name is Jean Auge. Florence Binet made a reference to us. We were the very first French family to receive gene therapy. I think families in Milan receive a lot of consideration. When Augustin, our third child, was treated, Nathanael, who's our second child, who unfortunately passed away since, received extensive care, very good care in terms of physical therapy, and we were there for Augustin, but they were very instrumental and did everything they could to have a holistic approach of the family. They did not just take the child, they really gave consideration to the entire family. And I think that this is really important. Well, thank you indeed for sharing, says Grégoire. You're absolutely right. I think that's the non-scientific part, but obviously it is essential, and it should be done properly. Sebastian Mariotti, would you like to add something? I had you on my... Oh, there you are. There you are. Yes, thank you. I'm a bit in the same case as Jean-François. I'm an AMN adult. I didn't go through the Jean-François' protocol. I was looking for the for the reference, but I can't remember. I was in a protocol for about the same duration. I think it was about 2 years. We had initially placebo for 1/3 of the patients. I had to go to the hospital a few times for tests. I was very fortunate, unlike Jean-François, because I live in the greater Paris area. So traveling back and forth makes it a lot easier. Obviously, you have to take time off from work, but I didn't have the additional burden of having to travel. I went to the hospital during the day, went back home, could sleep at home. Jean-François, obviously, it was difficult. I did not go for MIN 102 protocol. It's funny to see how much people question the vaccine these days when we are willing to take anything when there is a glimpse of hope. So I didn't go for MIN 102. I'd been in this other protocol for 2 years, and it involves a lot of tests, MRIs. It's a significant burden, and MRIs are just not great. But as far as the protocol itself was concerned, I think I received great assistance. It was the hospital where Professor Aubourg worked. It was a great team. They were fully involved in trial protocols. And for me, it was a good experience. I never had the impression that they were hiding anything from me. The protocol ended up not being that successful, but that's another story. Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you so much. It's true that you're right. These days, people have a sometimes a strange perception of science, and at the same time, some patients like you are willing to take huge risks for themselves, but also for others. Absolutely. It's oftentimes very altruist. So, once again, I think it's important to say how brave, how much courage those patients have. Marie-Claude Blondeau, if you're here, I forgot to mention you, but it's good to have you with us. I think we have a question from the audience. Elise? Yes, Alberto Sierra. If you have a question, please use your microphone. Once again, make sure you switch on your mic. We're not hearing anything at this point.
Non, en attendant, puis on y revient.
Okay, obviously we're not hearing anything. May I maybe ask a question, says Grégoire. Well, hold on, I think we have maybe Brigitte. Brigitte, can you hear us? Yes. Can you hear me okay? Yes, we can hear you loud and clear, Brigitte. Please go ahead, ask your question. Hello, everyone. I would like to come back to some of the issues mentioned by Florence Binet about information and the loss of information sometimes. It's true that we don't see everything. Mrs. Bines said, "I wish I had known. I wish I had received such information." I've faced the same difficulties. Simply being informed about a given situation. I went through this after about 30 years ago, after bone marrow transplant in MLD. In 2016, I looked into what could happen to my daughter, and there was no information. Professor Aubourg told me there is no database. So in other words, no data was collected many years ago. So I did a lot of research in scientific literature. What happens about 10 years after a transplant, or 12 years after? Well, nothing. There is nothing. So back to MLD and gene therapy in MLD. My question is the following. Is there an international database that exists that can be used by scientists, researchers, physicians, but also families? Of course, this raises one important question. What do we mean by data? What kind of data? As parents, as families, you are interested in purely scientific data, but also non-scientific or less scientific data. What happens from a psychological standpoint, for example? My daughter passed away 2 years ago. I wish I wish I had had more information. She suffered, and I think that pain should be somewhere, maybe in the data. I think, could I turn to Valeria? Valeria, I think maybe you're the person who's in the best position to answer that question. I can maybe add a bit to the answer after Valeria. But I think Valeria, when she spoke, she said that it's important to know better know pathologies, better document them. So maybe, Valeria, you want to shed some light on this and answer the question?
Thank you very much. I think all the discussion is very interesting. What I find sometimes difficult is that I briefly mentioned during my speech before, that is sometimes, especially with the rare disease and for the experimental treatment, we don't know everything. So, and this and because we have a limited experience, because the numbers are little, and so we cannot draft conclusions early or based only on single cases. And so sometimes we don't have clearly answers to give clearly to the patient in terms of what we really expect on your child as outcome. So but I think even this difficulty that we have as doctors is important to be communicated well, because it's still part of the trust of the relationship that is between us as a doctor and as a patients, and also the fact that we gain information with time. We need to keep to try to make an effort as a doctor, as a clinician, to have all the opportunities that we need to keep our patients informed of what we understand during the time of the trial. yeah, and then another thing that maybe I want to briefly mention, I think as it was said, that all the requirement and the regulations have changed over years. So and of course we are required to sign a lot of paperwork that we call paperwork, and this is a kind of is a matter of transparency with the patients, because we need to inform them, but sometimes maybe we need to try a way to make it more simple, because sometimes it's really very heavy, because there is we spend more time on papers than on discussing really things, on clinical things that they may be more useful to discuss. I'm not sure whether I'm clear.
Ici, Valéria, peut-être.
Well, thank you, Valeria, says Grégoire. I don't know if Florian, would you like to say a word about data collection, the difficulty of collecting data for which is even more difficult in rare or very rare diseases?
I agree with Brigitte that often there is not enough published on long-term consequences of treatments, as well as the more advanced stages of disease. Most of research does focus on the early stages of disease that are more amenable to treatment. And in the literature, often the long-term follow-up is not reported as frequently. I also want to say, speaking to what Valeria mentioned, and the difficulties of consent. I think we often think of consent as Florence said, a lot of paperwork, but it is really, as Grégoire said, a process of information, trust, and transparency, and it should be a continuous process as such. So I know from experience, when you go through hardships, and patients also come and see me, you're not hearing everything that is being told to you. And it's emotionally not possible to do that. And often, your vantage point is very different than years later when you are at a different stage of the disease. And so I think it would all behoove us to try to make the consent process a continuous one that goes beyond that immediate enrollment participation, right? And knowing well that most patients don't absorb everything that is being written in the consent, because their objectives and their mindset and their emotional state and understandable desperation are shaping what they hear. And similarly, we physicians are guilty of only seeing some things during the consent process, and at a later stage, the mindsets might be better to allow for more exchange.
Merci beaucoup, Florian.
Thank you, Florian. The clock has been ticking really fast. It's 25 past the hour. Could I say a quick word, says Guy? I'd like to answer Bridget's question. I realize we don't have solutions for everyone, but if you can hear me, Brigitte, I think it would be good if you could sign up to ELA Connect, which is the database we've created at ELA. It's been Leuco Connect, sorry. It's been designed specifically for what you described. It is a fully secure database that can be used by scientists and physicians. So this is probably the place to give us feedback on your background and your story with your daughter. Thank you. Thank you. When I tried to do this, I couldn't find a place to specifically submit this information. And I was really interested because I thought I'd found the place. Maybe things have changed, so I should maybe look at it again. I back when I tried, I didn't get the sense that it was working, but maybe it's better now. Well, Brigitte, maybe we can put someone in touch with you. Don't worry, I'll manage. I'll manage. I know that sometimes websites can be complicated. Maybe it's just a matter of knocking on the right door. That's what I meant, says Gregor. Okay, well, thank you. And just to echo what Guy said and also what Florian just said, I think, and for everyone here to understand, it is important to recognize that there are different types of research. Florian, Valeria work on very specific targets, sometimes generally in early phases, and it would be interesting to have epidemiological information on clinical signs of pathologies, where the place of patients, as Guy said, is really important. We're talking about rare diseases. So if someone has relevant clinical data and doesn't submit it, doesn't communicate it, well, then our knowledge on long-term symptoms of the disease is going to be very limited. We need as much information as possible. We need to collect as much information as possible. It's absolutely essential. So I think your question and your comments are really, really helpful. As you said, I hope my daughter went through this, but not for nothing. And you're right. We don't want knowledge to be lost. Knowledge should not be lost, and it's even more true with rare diseases. Please allow me to also come back one moment to what Florian and Valeria said. The question of consent, the legal, the medical consent, which in many trials has no sense. Asking someone to sign a zillion forms makes no sense. I remember putting 1,000 patients on a trial once, and more than half never signed a consent. They thought they'd never signed it. So that shows that it's not the right tool. It's an administrative thing. We have to go through it, but I think that from an ethical standpoint, a lot has yet to be invented. We have clinical researchers who are purely responsible for communication and patients management. Coaching, for example, patient coaching in research trials, and I'm absolutely convinced that's, as Florian said, I agree with him, ongoing consent. We need to permanently inform. And I think that more and more we're going to see this. More and more research teams will do this. And hopefully this will better meet patients' expectations. And patients should also pressure researchers to do this. And sponsors could very well say, we want patients to be better informed. It should be part of the project, of the trial. We're going to see whether the person... Do we have any further questions? Yes. Go ahead. Josette? Josette, can you hear us?
Oui, on vous entend, madame.
Hello. I've been listening very carefully since the beginning, and you've been talking about consent. My children had ALD, and my son every Wednesday had to go to the Saint Vincent de Paul hospital for a perfusion. And one day, my son, who felt he'd not been explained clearly why he was doing this, told me, "Mum, I think I'm being a guinea pig." And we ended up being in this trial. It was back in 1998, not really understanding and eventually not really knowing why we were in this trial. So it's true that the administrative burden is huge. It's a problem, but at the same time, some paperwork is necessary because patients have to be informed. Patients need a minimum amount of information to at least know where they're going and what is happening. The interpreter apologizes. The sound is really bad. I'm trying to do my best to make sense. Thank you, says Grégoire. Thank you so much for your comments. I think things have really improved. I'm not being judgmental. I'm not saying that things were bad or good, but in France, there is a law on biomedical research, which became effective about 30 years ago, and things have really progressed. And we're not saying there should be no initial consent or information. Everybody said that what we need is ongoing consent and initial consent. But it's true that once upon a time, the initial consent maybe wasn't done right, wasn't done properly, and it's a fact. And thank you for sharing your experience. I think today we're going a lot further today, as a matter of fact. And what we're trying to do today, what research is trying to do today, is to develop literature for children, for example. The parents sign the legal consent. But in the meantime, it is important to also inform children. It's more complicated, depending on their age. When they're very, very young, when they're newborns, underage too, it's impossible. But I think your comments are important because we are working to improve information and not just legal information. This is not about signing. It's not about a binding signature. What is important is for people to understand and know and accept where they're going. I remember working for a guy who told me that you can ask patients to read 40 pages and ask patients to sign now they have no clue what they're signing, or you could show them a very short video without a signature and give them more information and better information. So it is important to make a distinction between ethics on one side and administration on the other side. So again, thank you for sharing.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions?
Do we have any further questions, Elise? Let's take one final question.
Allez-y.
Vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me? Yes. Hello. This is the second time I'm attending a symposium. Unfortunately, my children have XQ28 mutation, and I myself have AMN. I worked also as a nurse in Belgium in oncology, and my children only have the Addison disease, which is one form of the genetic mutation they're still very young, but when it comes to having to well-informed consents, I think that the amount of information, difficult to understand information for patients, and this is something you referred to. I think the amount of information has to be adjusted, and what we really need is education. I worked in oncology, and I've seen many patients who were in terminal phase, and at that stage of a disease, you're willing to sign anything. And many of the patients I worked for ended up dying. But I had many patients sign documents, knowing myself what was going to happen. I knew very well what was going to happen to those patients. And I always thought to myself, if this should happen to myself, I would do my very, very best to understand as much as possible, understand everything. But I think that at one point, patients need someone to help them understand the consents. Again, I don't know exactly how many documents should be signed. Somebody said hundreds or a zillion. Once again, I think it is important to provide someone's support to patients or families to help them understand before they sign. Thank you. Well, I think things are going to improve. Today, medical students are educated on that specific subject, which was not the case a few years ago. There are people, take Florian, who recognize that oral information is a lot more information than written information. And so that's one thing. Second, as you said, Sylvie, there are new professionals. Researchers are very busy, physicians are very busy, but what we're seeing is new profiles who are emerging, new professions emerging, who could be used to help people do what you just described. And in addition to legal documents, what we need is educational documents. And I think all this is in the pipeline. It is happening. And I think you know very well what I'm talking about because you're a healthcare professional. And you're right. Not all patients, are in a position to understand. There are social inequalities, cultural inequalities. And I think we have to have the courage to say this and recognize this and adapt material and literature accordingly. It's a lot of work. The last question or not? Guy, maybe a closing, just a few closing words? Well, I have a question for Florian and for Valeria. I heard Jean-François earlier, who for 2 years didn't know if he had the right molecule or placebo. AMN is one of the best known leukodystrophies. The same thing is true for MLD. With gene therapy, we're not even considering placebo, but it can be considered from MIN-102. So the question is this step absolutely necessary, or could we skip it? I think a lot of patients would like to skip it. Florian, what do you think? Florian, you want to answer this question?
Yeah, you're right, Guy, that a placebo represents a difficult component of trials. but often one that may accelerate benefit for future patients. If I think about what happened in the early days of SMA treatment with antisense oligonucleotides, we would not be where we are today if there had not been a placebo in the first trial, and we wouldn't have recognized how well the antisense oligos were working compared to placebo. I think we will have in future more sophisticated trials that use adaptive trial design, where there might be not so much a placebo, but a delayed start of some patients compared to others, allowing us to compare treated and untreated patients while allowing everybody access to treatment over time. You're right that for gene therapy for the young children that are rapidly declining is not justified, and therefore we will continue to not have placebo. But I do think that some of the later onset forms of disease, it's going to be a lot harder to know whether the treatment works without some comparator and with untreated. So that I'm not saying that this will mean that there are patients who go untreated, but it might just be a trial design that will have some patients be treated at a slightly later stage. And as difficult as that might be in the beginning, it will allow us to give more definitive answers and more information that you've heard the patients are asking for information, right? They want to have answers. We right now don't have answers. And if we don't have these kinds of comparators with untreated, it's going to be difficult. Does that help?
Est-ce que
Valeria, would you like to add something? Because it's also nice that we have your vision on this complex issue.
Thank you very much. I agree with Florian. Personally, I understand that the issue of placebo is something that is very difficult to understand, even for us clinicians and scientists. But what I can say from my personal experience, that the importance of the comparator, the comparator group is important to demonstrate the efficacy of a treatment. Of course, if this can be achieved without a placebo group, of course, the trial must be designed in that way. And of course, in rapid progressive disease, is not possible to include it. But a comparator is important. Even in our gene therapy trial, the natural history trial have been really important, because it really gave us the base and the data that could make the comparator with the gene therapy group, and without having followed all these children that sometimes were the siblings of our patient that unfortunately were too advanced to be treated. Without that information, at the end, we were never been able to demonstrate the difference. So we may need to think a more sophisticated design trial in order to avoid this, but especially for the rare disease, it's very important to have a group where we can know better the disease. Yeah.
Can I maybe just add
Je
one
pense
more?
que pour le public qui nous écoute, hein, c'est
For the people listening to us, it's important that they hear what you have to say. Obviously, the placebo is a very important ethical issue, and that's why it's important that also the researchers get a chance to talk about this. In cancer treatment, for instance, we no longer use placebo. What we do now is that we compare an old treatment with a new treatment, so no patients are without a medication. Sometimes we measure the size of the tumor, and that's easy to measure with imaging or biological markers. However, when we're talking about diseases where the symptoms are the capacity to walk or cognitive functions, you know, some mornings you get up and you're not feeling as well as the day before, so you might not have the same cognitive or neuromuscular capacities versus the day before or the day after, and that's why we need a placebo. Sometimes it's absolutely essential. But as my colleague said, in the future there will be more intelligent ways to design the studies. Maybe the placebo group will be smaller. There used to be a time when it was 50-50. Maybe also in the future, the patients themselves will be their own comparator. They will be comparing one day with and one day without. But again, placebo is not something that we cannot consider today. And also participating in the research is taking a risk for the benefit of others. That's a very generous way of participating in research. I'm not trying to be too emotional, but some people can say, look, I did something that was helping others. I was not necessarily doing it for myself. I was also doing it for the others. It's tough, but it's a very, very generous attitude. I don't know, Guy, what do you think? Do we want to conclude the panel discussion now, or are there any other questions? Elise, everybody got a chance to say what they had to say? I think we need to close the first panel discussion. We're late already. Elise, we take a 10-minute break. So please be back in 10 minutes. Okay, we start again in 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much to everyone, the patients and our research colleagues from very far away who participated thanks to the Zoom technique. Thank you.
Bien, Élise, est-ce que tout le monde est de retour?
Elise, is everybody back? Yes, we have our participants. Can I go? Yes, we can start. I'll just say a couple of words to get the second round table starting. Thank you for those of you who are still with us this afternoon. It's raining so much today, and it's so interesting to listen to this meeting that I'm actually quite glad that I'm here rather than outside. Well, thank you very much for those of you who are still listening. The second panel discussion will be just as important as the previous one, but maybe not so well known and less discussed with the patients. So thank you very much to Guy for having prepared this subject. I remember 40, 50, I remember the story of 40, 50 years ago, the Pima Indians in the US, a group of Native Americans who were used for research in diabetes because they have a greater prevalence of diabetes, and they were used for treatments with their consent. And once the day came to discuss access to care, these populations were disregarded and abandoned and did not have access to the care. So the discussion here is about partnership. In partnership, we should never forget the ethical issues, i.e., in the end, the group of patients who participated in the research, do they at least get the positive results of the research or not? And there's also something more touchy. We know that today there are financial links in research, and fortunately we have financial links, we have funding, we have industrial partners and academic partners. And yet, when we look at how the patents are divided and distributed, how the retribution is distributed, we still have to have a discussion to understand whether the way the money and the patents are being distributed is fair. And there's another question. Is the profit sufficiently invested again in research? And is part of the profit, could part of the profit not be also given to medical and social support for the patients? Because, you know, the patients, what do they expect? Better management, better care. And although basic research will not necessarily provide medical and social support to the patients, it could happen. So we have to think about that, and I know there is a discussion taking place right now. Guy, you have the floor. Can you hear me? Yes, I had a slight microphone issue. Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, I'm not going to say much more than Grégoire, and I'm not going to go over the story of the last 30 years regarding the research in the field of ELA. But ever since ELA was created in 1992, we decided to fund medical research. Medical research is one of the two main aims of the ELA associations. And also the second aim is to support the families on a daily basis. Initially, the association was made of families who were worried for their children suffering from adrenoleukodystrophy, one of the less rare leukodystrophies. And at the time, with Professor Aubourg and Nathalie Cartier, we worked on gene therapy for cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy. And over the years, ELA developed a network of patients and families who were interested by the therapy and invested 6 million euros in the research. So we consider ourselves a major partners, and therefore we thought that it was fair and legitimate, although not everybody shared that opinion that ELA should be involved in the results. And that's the reason why a contract was signed later with INSERM and other partners regarding gene therapy. The idea was to provide a financial retribution in the event of a commercial use of the research outcome, and we committed ourselves to reinvest that money in the research for leukodystrophies. Well, so far we never got a penny, but that experience at least taught us something, because it made us aware of the fact that a family association such as ELA, a European international association, offered the best guarantees as research partner. Why am I saying this? Because an association such as ELA has 3 trump cards. I'm not saying that the others don't, but we have 3 advantages. First, we have developed a network of families which are well informed. 2, we are providing new funding in an area that is not attracting pharma companies too much. It's starting, but it's not much. And 3, we make tools available for the scientific community, such as our platform to study, platform of study. We talked about LeukoNet. And for the families listening to us, LeukoNet is our platform. And I believe that it's very important that we meet on this platform in order to increase the quantity of data needed by research. Finally, we manage this in a way where we get nothing in exchange. We just do it for the sake of doing it. So ELA is a very good partner for research. In the meantime, we had a chance to invest €500 or even up to €1 million in some research programs. I'm not going to go over those programs in detail, because some programs will be introduced to you by the investigators. But we were also contacted directly by public laboratories or private laboratories looking for patient groups. And again, this is why it's important that we know the partner, that we know the patients, and it's also important that we have the LeukoNet platform. And finally, we are the advocates of the patient's interests and rights. We need to share the data with other research groups in order to speed up research. At the same time, we are directly involved if there is a patent, which means that we will participate in the future development of the research outcome. And we are also sharing in the commercial profits so that we can reinvest in the research for leukodystrophy. So this is a summary. We have more time for the round for the panel discussion, but that's in the summary what I wanted to say to fuel the discussion. I'm very impatient to share my experience and share with you the other players' experience to improve the outcome and the fallout for the patients who are involved and who are in need of this therapy. Thank you, Grégoire, for having given me the floor. Well, thank you, because you're shedding light on the role played by partners, sponsors, and patients' associations. We will also listen now to Frédéric Sedel and Nathalie Cartier. And if I may rephrase this, the audience listening to us must know that now the way we talk about the economic model and research is a healthy way. It's an open way of doing it. We cannot... some people are in favor of asking the government and the state to pay for everything. That's not realistic. There are those who say pharma companies are awful people and they do everything for money, and I don't think that's true either. And then in the middle, we have the academic researchers who are trying to find their way around. So it's very important that we hear from our 2 colleagues who are going to explain. We will listen to Frédéric Sedel regarding the biotin trial, and then the next speaker will talk about the leukodystrophy gene therapy trial. So Frédéric, you have the floor.
Good afternoon.
I don't know if you can see me. Yes, we can see you. Can I share my screen? I had a few slides I wanted to show you. Well, we can ask Elise. She's in charge of all the technical aspects. I think you should be able to share your screen. Okay. You see it? Yes, I do. We do. So thank you, Mr. Moutel. Thank you, Guy, for having asked me to bring my contribution to the discussion by telling you about the biotin trial. I will summarize the history of the biotin trial. ELA participated right from the beginning of the trial. It all started in 2006-2012, first phase. At the time, I worked for the La Pitié Hospital, specializing in rare diseases, especially in adult leukodystrophies. And I had 5 patients with a very specific leukodystrophy with optic neuropathy responsive to high-dose biotin. So we sequenced the genome to try and identify the gene, and we did identify a gene, and we published with Marjo van der Knaap in 2013 a mutation in the CLC2 gene in 2 of the patients out of 5. So 3 patients had no mutation, but 1 of the patients actually had multiple sclerosis, which oriented us towards high-dose biotin as a therapy. We started with a pilot study in 23 patients with an improvement in the symptoms for progressive multiple sclerosis, and that led to the creation of a startup, the aim of which was to develop treatment therapies for neurologic diseases, starting from molecules that act on the cerebral metabolism. So it was a new approach to develop for neurology. The whole story lasted for approximately 10 years with 2 pivot trials, phase 3, one which had a positive outcome and led to an ATU authorization, early access program authorization, in waiting for the final results. And the second international trial actually did not replicate the results of the first trial and led to the company stopping its activity. So that's what we said earlier. Sometimes we ask questions and we get negative results and negative answers. So the mechanism of action of biotin, it makes sense in demyelinating diseases, because in this case there is an increase in the request for ATP, and biotin plays a role in the cycle that produces ATP for neurons, and we hope that we can stop neurodegeneration. And biotin is also playing a role in an enzyme that is active in the synthesis of fatty acids that myelin is made of. So there was a rationale to test this approach, and some results had been achieved in animal models of adrenoleukodystrophy, showing that high-dose biotin allowed to stabilize the clinical and histopathological scores in knockout mice models, so where they had ABCD1 and ABCD2 gene deletion, and these mice developed a disease that was very close to adrenoneuropathy. And we had 1 patient who had been treated at La Pitié Hospital for compassionate reasons and had improved walking capacities being treated with high-dose biotin. And when we stopped in the treatment, his walking capacity decreased. When we introduced the treatment, they increased again. So there was a rationale again. It made sense, especially if we took in consideration what had been observed with multiple sclerosis previously with very good results. We decided to start another therapeutic trial. Mede was a very young company. We had been able to raise funds not for adrenoleukodystrophy, but for multiple sclerosis, and to develop new indications. And talking to ELA, we decided on a contract, which can be summarized as follows. ELA was funding a randomized clinical trial, phase 3 randomized clinical trial, pivotal study, conducted according to the pharma company standard, 800,000 euro. Medday reimbursed ELA in the event that the drug became sold for adrenal dystrophy or multiple sclerosis. And if it was sold for adrenoleukodystrophy, then Medday would pay 5% of all its revenues to ELA, up to 5 million euros. That was the agreement, the deal at the time. So it meant that not only if it worked out well, there would be a therapy for the patients, and ELA would get the recoup the money and make some additional money if the therapy was sold. There were not that many randomized placebo-controlled trials for AMN, and this is maybe one of the rare, very few international trials recruiting, including 67 men suffering from adrenoleukodystrophy in 4 centers, 2 in France, 1 in Barcelona, and 1 in Germany, Leipzig. 66 patients divided in 1 placebo group. And it was interesting what you said earlier. We already at the time tried to decrease to the minimum the number of patients included in the placebo group. So 1/3 of the patients were getting the placebo, 2/3 were getting the active ingredient for 12 months. And then so that there would be no loss for the placebo patients, we switched over. And the placebo, the placebo patients were then given the treatment, and so it's not that they never got the treatment; they just got it later. That's how we had developed the trial with ELA, and there were assessments every 3 months, clinical assessments, MRI, and the primary outcome was the walking distance in 2 minutes. The 2-minute walk test, as we call it. The patient walks for 2 minutes as quickly as possible, and we measure the distance covered. And we tried to find whether there was an improvement or a deterioration after 12 months versus the baseline situation before they started being treated. These are the trial results not published yet. We're still waiting for the publication from the investigators. However, the trial was negative, unfortunately. We observed no difference in the walking distance between M0 and M12. 12 months might have been short. The placebo group improved by 2 meters, and if the placebo group does not deteriorate, there's nothing else we can do. We did not have any additional effect in the biotin group. The other tests went in the same direction. There was no difference between baseline and M12, and no difference between the placebo group and the treated group. So it's really a flat signal, no remarkable adverse events in either groups. So unfortunately, the trial proved to be negative. Unfortunately. But on the other hand, when we do a clinical trial, we don't know the outcome in advance. So we asked the question, was there a rationale to start testing this treatment? I think the trial was well conducted because the results were clear. Nobody dropped out. There were no missing data. We did not have to use complicated calculation methods. The trial was well conducted. The patients were all on board and followed the trial to the end, but unfortunately the therapeutic effect we had expected was not observed, and we moved on. So in a few words, that's what happened with the MD-103 trial. Maybe the trial was too short. That may be biased, because maybe the fact that we wanted to reduce the time spent on placebo and we did not give the trial enough time to show an effect. But maybe also the treatment is simply not efficient. It's not working. And that's the conclusion that we came to in this situation. The trial was made possible by ELA. We could never have been able to conduct the trial. Medday could not fund it. And Medday actually reimbursed ELA fully, because we got some compassionate use programs in Europe, which allowed us to pay back ELA. We wish we had come up with an efficient treatment. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way, but it was again, the trial was well conducted, except that no efficacy could be shown. Thank you. If we want to use the terminology of rugby, we can talk about a converted try. It was a try and it was not converted. Obviously, it was not converted in terms of positive effects, but at least the fact that we were reimbursed was a first, and that was a converted try. Thank you very much, Frédéric. Seen from where we stand, it's interesting. I mean, your initiative is interesting. The willingness to pay back ELA and even give ELA a share of the possible earnings if the drug had been commercialized. I mean, that's interesting because it allows the association to continue investing for research. And for those listening in, before we move on to the next speaker, we need to remind you of something. I had a boss who said sometimes a negative try can be a positive try, and a negative trial can be a positive trial. Sometimes, you know, you have to, okay, you find a closed door, then you walk back and you go and knock on a different door. You know, sometimes negative trials are part of the job and they will orient you towards another door. And we're still fighting for negative trials to be published as well as positive trials, because at least people can discriminate. And it's very important to acquire scientific knowledge. I said Nathalie Cartier, but Elise says she's not yet connected. Maybe she cannot attend. In that case, we will move on with Mario van der Knap's presentation. The very interesting trial conducted on children, the Guanabens trial. And then we will have Bruno Fessel's presentation. So now we have Mario.
I share my screen?
Oui, c'est bon.
Shall I share?
Oui, tout à fait. Go ahead, Mario. J'arrête alors.
Shall I share my screen?
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Please go ahead. Share your screen. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Do you see it?
On voit bien.
We can see your screen, absolutely.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to participate in this symposium. And I would like to discuss the subject from the perspective of the Guanabens trial in vanishing white matter. Let me see. Yeah. I also have some general comments. I am a strong believer in partnership between families, patients and families and researchers. And I see to my delight that also patients and families are getting better organized, because I think the best partnership is if both families and patients have strongly organized themselves, and researchers need to be strong, they need to be independent, and they need to work for the same goal and have different roles, and they need to be true partners. If you look at the roles, then they are pretty much the same, but the contents of the roles are just different. Patents concern intellectual property, and they can come from anybody who had an idea. And this is my personal view. My goal in leukodystrophy research is to develop therapies for leukodystrophies. For instance, Guanabens for vanishing white matter. And seeing the developments in the last decade, my biggest fear is that therapies for rare disorders will be excessively expensive and in the end not affordable for all families and patients. And I find this very painful. I work on vanishing white matter since, I would say, 25 years. And a lot of families around the world have helped me. And many of these families were poor. And if I then would develop a therapy that's not affordable to those families who helped me, that would be unbearable. And I think really absolutely wrong. So my personal opinion is that the money generated by the patented therapy should be reinvested in research on leukodystrophies or into making the therapy affordable. So Guanabens is an old FDA-approved alpha-2 adrenergic antihypertensive drug. Its safety is known because it came on the market by the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. There's no long-term adverse effects. Its most important side effect is drowsiness, but it wears off. And it, apart from the alpha-2 adrenergic receptors, it has also a target on the cell stress response. And the cell stress response is deregulated in vanishing white matter and is central in its pathophysiology. Guanabens is supposed to inhibit GAD34. And the expected effect of GAD34 inhibition is an enhanced abnormal activation of the cell stress response and worsening of vanishing white matter pathology, actually. So we gave Guanabens to our vanishing white matter mice, and it had an unexpected effect. It improved motor function, ameliorated brain white matter pathology, and reduced the abnormal cell stress response activation. And it worked. The effect was quite good. So this was already a finding in 2016. So we filed a patent in 2017, and it's pending to the hospital, and it's not yet decided, but it looks good. Then we decided to develop a trial, a phase 1/2 trial for patients with vanishing white matter. It's an international trial with monocenter, so patients from many places around the world come to Amsterdam. We have permission for 40 patients, and the focus will be on patients with an onset below the age of 6. And we chose that in order to limit the trial duration. We focus on patients with a relatively rapid disease. And also the early onset patients have the most predictable disease. And we decided to use historical controls. And I would like, hearing the discussion in the first session, I would like to say something about it. We chose to do this because a child with vanishing white matter can be devastated in 6 months. So even if you design a trial in which you give a double-blind episode of 6 months, the child can already be devastated in that time. So we felt that it was unethical. But I have been actually attacked by many colleagues who think that the FDA and the EMA will disregard the trial results, even if possible, positive, because of the trial design. So I would like also to say to patients and families, you need to take your role, and also protesting with EMA and FDA, because they are sort of sticking to this placebo-controlled trial design, but there is really room for other trial designs. We have a beautiful natural history study from which we can get the historical controls. To limit the irreversible brain damage, we focus on patients early in the disease course, and the total trial duration will be 4 years. By donation, using donations of 500,000 euros, we made trial preparation. So we consulted EMA and we produced and formulated Guanabens. Then the overall trial budget is 2 million, and it's equally shared by the Dutch NIH, the Dutch Brain Foundation, ELA, and 2 foundations of patients and families focused on vanishing white matter. And the Amsterdam UMC covers the cost of the permanent staff and the patent. Let's assume that Guanabens is effective. Then we have agreed with the Amsterdam UMC and SonMV, and actually I forgot to add, we agreed this with ELA, that our aim is to make the Guanabens available on a non-profit basis. So all the income that there would potentially come from the patent will go back into making Guanabens as cheap as possible. We will primarily aim for registration with the EMA and the FDA, and to this purpose we will form a new entity which will set up contracts with the manufacturer and will take care of distribution among patients. And the aim for this entity is to hold the market authorization. If this proves not to be viable, we will use metrostrol preparation by the Amsterdam UMC pharmacy. And this pharmacy has experience with it. We do it for quinidioxycholic acid, for CTX. So all the Dutch patients with CTX are treated with a rather cheap variant of quinidioxycholic acid. And this pharmacy is also ready to do it for guanabans, and it can then be provided to patients who are declared to be patients of the Amsterdam UMC, and that's irrespective of country. So also if a patient in France or another country would be willing to be considered my patient, we could provide the guanabans. Of course, we open for share. We aim at sharing of data, so the raw data of the trial will be shared to allow further analysis. We'll facilitate reuse of data and, of course, go for open access publications. So far, the involvement of patients and family organizations, they have been involved in the trial plan, and actually I heard families at ELA and the ULF talking about this open label design instead of placebo control design, and that's why we decided on it. They helped us with funding. They helped a lot with practical help in trial setup, in providing information for families. They helped with spreading the news. They helped with monitoring the trial and are on the DSMB and a forum to evaluate the trial results. And they also help encourage vanishing white matter patients and families to join the International Vanishing White Matter Registry, because there will be multiple trials and there are already other trials in preparation. And the inclusion is facilitated greatly by having the patients registered. We have formed a consortium of clinical vanishing white matter experts. It's based in North America and the EU, because vanishing white matter is ultra rare and there are multiple drugs in development. So we'd be contacted by multiple companies to prepare for clinical trials. And we were worried about that the trials would be overlapping in time, competing for patients, and that in the end, all trials would be underpowered and fail. And we also worried about accessibility and affordability of the new drugs for vanishing white matter patients worldwide. So we formed a consortium in the fall of 2019 to contribute at the interface between companies and patients to optimize setup and organization of trials and impact development of therapeutics. So the mission of the Vanishing White Matter Consortium is to enable and accelerate therapeutics for vanishing white matter, aiming at accessibility and affordability for all patients. To this purpose, we established an international collaboration which engages partners to provide unbiased analysis of different therapeutics using smart trial design to address recruitment challenges of this rare disease. And currently we're working on a core trial protocol that we can offer different companies so that the core protocol will be shared and, for instance, controls can be shared. And we are working on the patient registry. So that the patient registry will be international so that any researcher worldwide can file a request to the registry and then have the data set needed for the specific project. This was what I prepared to say. And should I stop sharing?
Merci.
Good, thank you. Thank you. Interesting example. Let's see, says Grégoire. Could I ask you a quick question? I think you said non-for-profit at one point. Could you be more specific? I think I just wanted to make sure, when you say non-for-profit, does it mean that there is no financial transaction during the period of the trial, or does it mean that at the end of the trial, the redistribution makes it a non-for-profit?
Of course, for free for patients, so we cover the cost of the trial, but after the trial our aim is to make, if effective, the drug available at just the costs for making and distributing the drug, but no profit. So it's for after the trial.
Juste pour que les spectateurs.
Okay. Just to make sure everybody understands. So you would be going through the Amsterdam pharmacy. So this is a very specific research protocol where the Amsterdam Institute will be making the product for you. Is that correct? Did I get that correctly?
Yes, that there are two possibilities. One is that we have market authorization and we can have another small company, for instance, making it for us and distributing it for us at cost-based. And if that's not working, then the Amsterdam pharmacy will do it for us. And so there are two possibilities. But our specific aim is indeed to make the drug available to everybody worldwide at the lowest possible cost.
Okay, a very last point, and then over to the next. This is interesting, I think, for all the people listening to the first roundtable, because you're a part of people who included patients very early, simply to inform them. And this is not a question, but I think it's important because it's obviously a great example of co-construction between physicians and researchers and patients. I believe we still don't have Nathalie Cartier, do we? I don't think so. In that case, we're going to move to Bruno Flessel, who's next on the agenda. I did not mention earlier about intellectual property. Intellectual property is very important when research is co-built, co-constructed between academics, patients, pharmaceuticals, and so on. Well, obviously, the question of intellectual property is sensitive because eventually this will determine how much value a patent has. So, Bruno, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for contributing. Over to you. Thank you, Grégoire. Thank you, Guy. I'm going to share my screen if possible. Hold on.
Je ne sais pas si vous voyez.
Can you see my screen? We can see your screen. Okay. It was really interesting to have the two previous presentations from Frederick and from Mario. One was more with an industrial view, and the other one, even if Frederick is a physician, Frederick was also a business person. And then we have a physician who sees patients every day and wants to treat those patients every day. So we have slightly different approaches, but at the end of the day, the problem is the same. When you have partnerships, the problems are the same regarding intellectual property. So I tried to take the ELA approach. Before you launch a clinical trial, as we just heard with Mario, there is a lot of experimental work which is conducted, sometimes in vitro initially, then on animals. Frederick said that he treated patients in a hospital setting initially, and then decided to look at whether it could be done on XALD. And so ELA, as we saw, can be part of the funding very early in a trial. So the question is, what returns should ELA expect? There is risk. Potentially, you could find something, which means that potentially there could be a patent. So I think that ELA has somewhat changed the way it participates. And I think that they said that if there are really interesting findings in a program funded by ELA, well then if it would be possible for ELA to have some return on investment, which could then be used to finance and fund other research programs. Then we have the question of clinical trials. Here again, ELA can play two roles. They, first of all, can act as a funder. As the previous speakers said, ELA could fund or co-fund a program. Thanks to its network and databases, ELA could also help recruit sufficient number of patients to get significant results, for example. And ELA can also contribute to the monitoring of patients, especially if a trial takes place in different locations, in different centers or hospitals. So these are two examples of partnerships with ELA. If there is a patent request, what could happen is that the clinical trial could be published, and once you've published your research, it's too late. You can no longer protect it with a patent. So when ELA funds clinical research, they can no longer co-own or be associated to the clinical property of the patent. So the partnership has to be different. As Frederick Siddell said with MedDay, ELA asked for a partnership with potential royalties had the trial been conclusive. So the role of ELA is to provide early funding and then the acceleration of clinical trials. For orphan diseases, because ELA has extensive knowledge of its patients, and they fund programs that are of little interest for pharmaceutical companies. So the real question at the end, and this question I think was addressed or raised by Mario, what is the vision of a hospital or a physician who sees patients and wants to improve the lives of those patients? What do you do if my clinical trial is positive? How do I make this molecule available to all patients? And the real challenge, as Mario said, is to get approval for this drug, get it to be authorized, and then identify an industrial partner who can manufacture the drug, do all the paperwork. We're talking about thousands and thousands of pages. So I enjoyed the example given by Mario, the creation of a foundation. You could either go through an existing foundation or create a foundation from scratch. And that is a very interesting approach, because obviously profit is no longer a relevant question. The purpose is not so much to earn money, but the purpose is really to improve the lives of patients, which is really the primary mission of ELA. So, as we saw, MedDay is willing to go through the approval process and also fund or refund ELA to allow ELA to fund other and new programs. What I noticed in the previous presentation is that they for Guanabance for VWM, vanishing white matter, they asked for a patent, and the same thing was true in the previous presentation. So no matter what strategy you have, no matter who is behind the strategy, a public hospital or an industrial organization, patents are really important, because at the end of the day, it's a patent that allows you to, in a sense, control the market. I guess what we want is to make sure that the investments we make also benefit patients. So with that in mind, here are some key questions. I don't have the answers. I don't have the solutions. Every project is different. It depends on whether you're in a clinical trial or fundamental research. But it is important to have partnerships in order to develop treatments to make patients' lives better. And for private or public organizations, ELA is a key player because ELA will help you go further in your clinical trials and go from treatments to real life. So how do you build partnerships? Well, we have two examples. I think MedDay recognized the importance of ELA's funding, and that is why they decided to pay back. And the hospital, Mario's hospital, said, okay, ELA is funding the program, but at the end of the day, my objective is not to earn money. So I'm not going to pay back, but we're going to give back to patients by making the product, this clinical protocol, available to patients through the foundation or through the hospital or the pharmacy of Amsterdam. So I think, sorry, my slides don't describe what I'm saying, but I think that for both examples I just gave, we have a lot of interesting insights. ELA's role could have generated funds for new projects. It could have allowed the launch of a drug which improves the lives of patients and generate knowledge that can be used in research for other pathologies. Thank you. Thank you, Bruno. This was very interesting, and I think these questions also should be shared with those of you who are listening to us, the ELA members. I think these subjects have to be well understood, and I guess, forgive me if I'm a little provocative, but in France, we're never very comfortable with money questions. I know that there are several other countries that are connected, but in France, we're still finding it difficult to discuss these topics, especially in the non-for-profit world. People think that there are neutral donators that put money on the table, and there are donators. It's true, it's a fact, but it's not the only source of funding for non-for-profits. So I think it is, we have to recognize this. If a non-for-profit organization wants to last, they need to have a reliable and modern business model. And that's what has been described.
L'argent pour l'argent, c'est pas gagner de l'argent pour s'enrichir, c'est de l'argent pour faire tourner.
Second thing is money not for the sake of being rich, but money for the sake of getting research flowing. I hope there will be questions, but we understand here what was said before. The ELA Association can be a player putting positive pressure on the way research is chosen. If ELA gets money and leverages that money, means that we are an acknowledged player. I myself believe that when you don't have any economic power, you're simply not acknowledged in the field of research, in the industry of research. You have to have some economical power. And finally, There was a discussion some years ago. Bruno, maybe you could have said something about that. But at INSERM, some years ago, there was a discussion. There were researchers producing data and knowledge, and no one thought that at a public administration like institution like INSERM, money could be made out of this research and this knowledge. So, you know, there is no evading it if you're a player in the field of research. And I'm here to represent ethics. All of this must be done in a transparent way. And if it is done in a transparent way, if it is well controlled, if there are auditors keeping an eye on everything, the system will be virtuous. It will not be negative. It will be a virtuous circles. And the ELA members are there to support what I'm saying. So I'd like to now give the floor to the participants. Maybe if Guy wants to say something, because Guy is on his own. There was Gaël de Mieux-Mondre, president of ELA Belgium. I don't know, who wants to start the discussion? Maybe there is a question from the audience. No questions from the audience, but we can encourage anyone who would like to ask a question to raise their hands, so the virtual hand. I'd like to react to what you said, Grégoire. 20 years ago, public institutions were plundered by companies. Their structure to leverage the fruit of their research were too weak, and so they actually got plundered. But it's not like that today at all. It even becomes sometimes rather difficult for private institutions to survive. Public institutions have become much more powerful. Now, ELA is different because ELA is not there to make money for the sake of making money, of becoming rich. We're talking, I mean, the audience must understand that we're talking about diseases with very few patients, rare diseases. So it's difficult to organize a clinical trial if you don't have enough patients. I mean, you have to have a sufficient population of patients to then derive statistics. And if the statistics are negative, it means the trial did not work well enough. Maybe it was too short, whatever. But organizing a trial is very expensive. And you need patience. The funding cannot come from public institutions. A hospital is there to take care of patients, not to fund research. They participate in the clinical research, but they can't fund the clinical trials. And for the pharma company or the industry, it's becoming very expensive, especially when there is a risk of the trial being a failure, as we were shown earlier with the MedDay example, especially when all in all, the market is relatively limited and very small. So ELA plays an essential role, but nowadays we cannot believe that ELA is only there to fund research. And that's what I wanted to convey. Of course, ELA is a funder, but it should be considered like more than that. It should be more a partner than a funding association. Because ELA provides funding, but it also provides a database, a network, some knowledge, and the knowledge has value. We have seen that the consortium on VWM is as important as the funding. Thank you very much for this contribution. Yes, I think that's what we're actually showing this afternoon. At the beginning of the afternoon, we talked about partnership and the contribution made by patients to research. We also talked about what ELA could do to support research and provide logistical support. But funding is one additional contribution. ELA is not just a funding institution. And rather than using a word that is not adapted, you know, we talk about social and solidarity, social and inclusive economy, And exactly, that's what we're referring to. An association, a patient's association is not there to make money, but to have money that can be used and can be invested for the benefit of the patients. And it's an ethical dimension. It's not the same thing as saying the association wants to make money because they have to pay for their expenses, because they have to pay for the salaries. I mean, that's also a discussion taking place in society, and I'd like to make a comparison. In mutual insurance companies, people complain that the money generated is not then given to the members of the mutual insurance, but rather used to pay for expenses. And money, if money is made, should be used to fund research, but also to provide support to the families and those taking care of patients. Well, as far as ELA is concerned, I said earlier that we had 3 advantages. ELA is a research partner. We also manage our company without any desire to make money. And also we have developed a connection with public and private laboratories. We are providing a data bank. So every single penny that we can collect with these partnerships is then invested again in research. We don't have to pay for operating expenses. Well, we do have expenses, obviously, and I don't see how any structure may function without operating expenses, but operating expenses are paid by other people, by other partners, so there's no confusion here. All of the money that is collected or will be collected with research and therapeutic trials will be invested again in research. I want to make that clear for anyone who might still harbor doubts. And recently we have made progress because we want to be considered as a real partner. And Bruno really explained that quite clearly. And thank you, Bruno. ELA, if ELA is not a partner, I don't see who could pretend to be a partner more than we are. We're there, we're everywhere. We're everywhere when it comes to clinical trials, obviously the ones we invest in. So it's quite clear for me, and things must be going in that direction, and I agree with Bruno. Every partnership is different. As Bruno said, it means that we have to renegotiate in a different way every time. Depends on the situation, depends on the partner, depends what stage the research is at. And it's up to us to adjust to the situation, but that kind of exchange is absolutely essential. Florian was asking for the floor because it's important that we get a contribution from the US as well. They're probably ahead of us in this field in the US, so maybe he could provide a useful contribution. Florian, you have the floor.
Thanks, Grégoire. And I just wanted to actually echo what Guy just said, which is that not one size fits all. There are many different ways of pursuing partnerships, and depending on the scenario, different things might be necessary. And so, as both Bruno and Guy pointed out, this diversity and recognizing this diversity is really important. There are so many different stages of drug development, from preclinical to phase 3, and to know at what point what intellectual property is going to be gained is so important. I think if there can be a think tank on strategy development in partnership, and also a way of tracking success, because what I worry about is that if we have too much preconceived knowledge about what works and what doesn't work, we don't see what is actually happening, and that requires a certain openness and an ability to document what is occurring. And so I think ELA plays a key role here, sitting right in the middle of it all, and having close connections to patients and funding preclinical research. But I think it should take a long view of past, present, future to say what works and what doesn't work, because we can create all sorts of principles, but if it does not put into action, and that if there is no actual change, no actual partnership, no trials coming about, what's the use of it? So I would be an advocate for understanding what is creating partnerships and actually implementing trials and change. If it's not leading to trials, it should not be pursued. So there's a certain pragmatics, I think, that ELA, having so many connections, could be a wonderful think tank and repository for these observations and ideas. And I think, one of the things we think about a lot in the US is how to invite new partners, how to incentivize connections, not only to new patient groups, to new physicians, scientists, but also to new industries that might not even know about us. Because we think the more people are involved with the leukodystrophies, the better the field will be. Yes, there is always the danger that individual companies will ask for huge sums of money for their products, but we're not even at the stage of having a lot of attention from companies. So I think we need to see that we create more awareness, more attention and engagement, so that we can also create some competition and bring prices down. So I think this sort of openness and inclusiveness of everyone is really important.
Merci, Florian. Alors,
Thank you, Florian. Will the Zoom dissolve if we go over our allotted time? Because Mr. and Mrs. Goychenko was asking for the floor, and we have to give a chance to all participants to take the floor. Go ahead. The interpreters apologize, but we can barely hear the lady. Back to what was said earlier regarding the aim of the ELA Association. For me, the ELA aim is obvious, but I talk to people about ELA in schools, in many places, but I get some very negative comments. People say, yes, but how is the money distributed? Is it distributed fairly? So what we heard this afternoon is obvious. But I don't know what we can do to make sure that we explain on a more international basis the fact that ELA does not have any wish to make money and become richer. It hurts me when people say, yes, but we don't know where the money goes and we don't know how the money is redistributed. And I find this really painful. So I'd like to to make this observation because this is something that I have experienced on the field for many years now. It hurts. You know, we're fighting every day. It hurts when people don't believe that we are doing this in a fair and honest way. I'll give a chance to Guy to reply to this question, but you know, there are always people eager to voice criticism. Whatever you do, you can be virtuous. So there will always be suspicious people. But the more transparent we are, the better we will communicate. Guy, well, no, not much I can say. I mean, I've known Josette for ages, the lady who just spoke. We can talk about this later. But suspicion will always increase in our society. And ELA is just like all the other associations. We're always being suspected of doing that sort of thing. There is a small percentage of people that reacts that way, and there's nothing we can do. We're not different from the others. And, you know, in this society where so many people are convinced that there are people plotting to keep the money and not be fair, there's not much we can do. Well, we'll come back to it. But as Guy said, there's not much we can add. But if you'd like to add something. I'm already convinced. It just hurts me when I see everything we're doing and when I hear that people are suspecting us of doing dishonest things. I don't understand how they could possibly react like that. The interpreters apologize. It's very, very difficult to understand what the lady is saying. The sound is very poor. We're sorry. Yes, but I'd like to come back to the heart of the discussion. There are always people eager to criticize. As Guy says, in our society, there are so many people who believe in the conspiration theory. You know, there are those people. There aren't that many, but they're there. So this is true in the field of support to disabled people, support to blind people, etc. ELA is an association that is a partner for financial reasons, and being a financial partner, we acknowledge, and therefore we can exert some pressure in the noble sense of the term, but also it's important for health-related democracy. It matters a lot that patients can have a say. Research must be democratic, but there is research regarding speech therapy, physiotherapy, home care, and it's important that the patients play an active role, that they can be the spokespersons for the research. So it goes beyond the fact that we are an acknowledged partner for funding. We're also an acknowledged partner to improve the life of patients. Health-related democracy is not just about being trustworthy. It's also about transparency and making sure that we advocate in favor of patients, and patients get a say when a major decision is being taken. I mean, there are orphan diseases, and by orphan we mean that they get no funding, but also they get no acknowledgement, and things are changing thanks to associations. So that's what I really mean to underline. And one last word. We talked about the foundations. I'm interested, and we have a specialist Bruno knows a lot about foundations. So can you, Bruno, tell us something about the role played by foundations? How can foundations be an appropriate player in this discussion? It's very difficult to provide an answer. I'm not saying that the foundation is like a super association, something above the association. Who started the discussion? I think Mario started the discussion when he talked about... Mario started the discussion when she talked about foundations to sell the possible therapy with the responsibilities that this carries. But foundations are submitted to even more stringent rules and regulations, and that could be an answer to the question. Associations receive tax incentives, but they are also audited. Foundations, it's even worse. I mean, they have to be approved by the local administration, by the prefect. Yes, Bruno. We've experienced both. We know the difference between the two. I don't think that an association like ELA and a foundation are audited in a very different way. It's more or less the same. And sometimes even as far as management is concerned, foundations are less difficult to manage because they don't need to have too many members to exist. But a foundation could not be used for a family network. We have the association, we had an association, and the association had then created a foundation. It's something different. But the foundation was not being audited more than the association. It was rather the other way around. So the difference is not really that one is better than the other. It's just that a foundation is different. A foundation is based on a capital, on an amount of money that it is not allowed to use. It should simply exist with the interest derived from that capital. That's what a foundation is about. And that's the main difference between an association and a foundation. It's not a major issue anyway for today's discussion.
And again, I'm speaking for France only. Right. Foundations in other countries are very different, whether it's in the US, the Netherlands, France, Belgium. Foundations can have very different statuses. But I think that at the end of the day, it doesn't make a huge difference. Well, I thought I would bring it up. I think we have a couple questions left. Elise, if I'm not mistaken? Yes. Over to Emmanuel. And make sure your mic is on. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, we can. Not so much a question. I would like to thank you. Simply thank you because I found the discussions really interesting around the circular economy. I found it very enriching, very insightful, and as a mother of a young boy with leukodystrophy, it was very helpful. Parents of children with these pathologies oftentimes are frustrated and angry, but what I heard today was helpful, and I simply wanted to share this with you. Thank you. Well, thank you. I think your thank yous should go to ELA, to the organization you're a member of. It's all coming from ELA. ELA came to us and said, we would like to innovate and take the debate to the next level. We'd like to share more, I'm a very attentive observer, and I do believe, indeed, that we're opening a door. We're opening a new door, and maybe we're trendsetters. When you're a trendsetter, it's not always easy to sell your concepts, but well, I think Guy has always been a trendsetter. He's always been one step ahead. But you're right. Being heard is difficult when you're always a step ahead. I agree. I can only agree with you, says Guy. I can only agree. I think because you're always a step ahead, because you're proactive, ELA is what it is. I just wanted to share that with you and say thank you. Well, again, as an observer, says Gregoire, I agree with you, and we will see. We will see where this debate will be 10 years from now. It'll be interesting to see. Elise, do we have a final question? Yes, from Ermine Nanga. Make sure you use your microphone, please. Hello. Good evening. Can you hear me? We can hear you. I, first of all, would like to thank you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak and share. I'm in Africa. I live in Cameroon. I have a child who was diagnosed 4 years ago. I contacted ELA in 2019, and I was told nothing could be done unless the child was in French territory. So my question is the following. Could ELA envisage to intervene for underprivileged families living in Africa? We have no options whatsoever. I was told, your child is sick. There is nothing we can do. It sounds like we've lost the speaker. She's back on. Does that mean children are condemned? We need some hope. We need a glimpse of hope. And I'm hoping that we could be involved with the clinical trial. It would really do us a lot of good. So I wanted to share with you, and the question obviously is, what can we do? And again, what can be done for poor countries? Thank you. Thank you, says Grégoire. I wish I could answer your question. I'm not a member of ELA myself. I think Guy should pick up this question. We have a lot of requests coming from all kinds of places around the globe, says Guy, simply because we're easy to find on the web. And when we get this kind of requests, it's very difficult for us because it obviously the problem is resources. If we had unlimited resources, we would be very happy to do something. However, what we can do, and hopefully this was the case for you, or will be the case for you, we will give you all the information we can and possibly put you in touch with a physician in Europe who could help you and answer some of your questions. At this point, this is all we can do. It is difficult, says Grégoire. For years, I worked for populations who were coming to France to receive healthcare, and I'm not saying nothing should be done with Africa and for Africa, but accessing treatments is equally difficult in France. When you have a rare disease in France with no treatments, there is pretty much nothing you can do. There are many families who are in a similar situation. If in Cameroon you know a physician or you know a nurse who would like to receive information to help you, that's maybe the easiest way to go. It's not just about accessing molecules, because even in France, some molecules simply don't exist. But there are all kinds of things you can do on the side. So I know it's not a silver bullet, I understand. But if you have maybe one or two healthcare professionals that you can put in touch with us, that would be a first step. Someone like Guy or someone like ELA could probably help you do this. Thank you for attending this afternoon's meeting. Thank you. Elise, do we have anything else? I don't believe so. Sorry, this is Emmanuel again. Just to answer the previous question, ELA is a parent organization, and I'm a mother myself. And we are a community, and I think that amongst parents we can help ourselves beyond borders. We're talking about rare diseases, orphan diseases, and as an active member of ELA and a parent, even if we're based in a different country, we can listen, provide some help, and assist. Thank you, Emmanuel. You're absolutely right. I was speaking about the medical approach or the health approach, but you're speaking about the parents, and you're absolutely right. The only barrier I can see is the language barrier. Okay, very good, very good. Thank you again. Anything else? Elise? Josette, well, the problem is, Josette, we're really struggling to hear Josette. I agree with what Emmanuel says. It is important to have strong connections between physicians, but also between families. It certainly has been the case for me. I've been in an ongoing relationship with several families, and it is very helpful having this opportunity to share with peers, in a sense, on very simple things, not very complicated things, but exchange with people who are like you. The network has really helped me morally, and I would like to thank you, since I have the floor, again, for organizing this event. Thank you so much. Mind you, Le Connect, the Le Connect platform is available to all parents and relatives. So it is one way also to get connected to the network of parents. Thank you, Gail. Okay, Guy, I think time has come to wrap up. This was a wonderful afternoon. I will keep it very short and give you the floor to close. We've been talking about research ethics. In the public debate, there are two ends. There is the patient consent, inclusion, participation, but on the other end, there are more political considerations around the resources available for research. So today we really had to make some arbitrations and cover only certain topics. In a few hours, there is only so much you can discuss, but we discussed two important topics this afternoon. And without patting ourselves on the back, I think we could say we innovated this afternoon. We took the patient approach, family approach, patient organizations, and looked at how they were involved in research protocols. Things are changing, but they're far from being perfect. It's all very much work in progress. And we explored the topic and looked at what has yet to be done, what is negative, what doesn't work, what needs to be improved. And obviously, I think we identified that a lot remains to be done. The second part of the session was recognized the fact that there are certain topics we never talk about, especially not in France. As I said, money and research funding requires a lot of maturity. What our colleague said about intellectual property was really important. Patient organizations should not be stolen, should not be robbed. They have tremendous value, and we need to make sure that we protect and preserve this value. So again, by opening this debate today, I think we're exploring territories, uncharted territories. I've learned a great deal myself, thanks to you. And I think that thanks to you, things can and hopefully will change. Guy, over to you for some closing comments. Thank you, Grégoire. I was very happy we were able to do this. I didn't realize we were trendsetters and we were opening new doors. And if that's the case, well, let's continue. And let's continue doing so. What I learned is that information has to be further improved. We discussed the very interesting subject of consent. We talked about trial designs, placebo, and so on, the duration of trials. We talked about the indispensable control groups, and so on and so on. So I think hopefully this was an opportunity for everyone to exchange, compare their views. As far as partnerships are concerned, I liked Florian's proposal to set up a think group around partnership strategies. I think this is something we should do. If we're invited, we'd like to be part of this. Hopefully this can be one of the next steps. And hopefully we can continue this event with additional workshops. Maybe, who knows, we will meet again a year from now to take stock and see where we stand. Again, share our views, see what's going better, how partnerships have improved. What the most important being that everyone, ELA has become and is a partner. We're here to listen to patients, to carry the voice of patients, and to support research. Because we need the researchers, and we profoundly respect researchers. And it is with that mindset that I think we can build something. Again, folks, everyone, many, many thanks. Grégoire, thank you so much for facilitating this afternoon. And everyone, hopefully we will see each other again soon. Bye-bye now. Bye.
Au revoir.